Welcome everybody to the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law's first webinar, examining the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on refugees and people seeking asylum in Australia. It's my very great pleasure to welcome over 400 of you to this event. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that all of us, wherever we are in Australia, are on Aboriginal land. And I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of that land, to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are with us today. The impacts of COVID-19 have changed all of our lives dramatically in ways that we could never have expected or imagined. We've been forced into isolation and unable to see our family and friends. Many have lost jobs that they thought were secure, or have been unable to continue their tertiary studies because they couldn't get back into the countries where they were enrolled. Children have lost time at school. We can't leave this country nor enter any other. There's an external threat we can't control, and we're living with immense uncertainty. Now imagine what it must be like when, as a refugee, you're forced to flee everything you've ever known, unsure if or when you will see your family again. When you're deprived of your education or your livelihood because you're stuck in limbo for years trying to find safety. Or when your freedom is curtailed because you're detained indefinitely. And now imagine what it's like if you have been through all of this and face COVID-19 as well. What is it like to experience this pandemic when your legal and economic status is already precarious, when you are already separated from your loved ones, when your movement is already curtailed, and when your future is already extremely uncertain? In today's webinar, we're joined by three experts who will shed light on the differential impact this pandemic is having on refugees and people seeking asylum living in the Australian community. I would like to introduce them to you now. Sarah Dale is the Centre Director and Principal Solicitor of RACS, the Refugee Advice and Casework Service in Sydney. RACS provides free legal advice, assistance and representation to disadvantaged and vulnerable people seeking asylum. In 2018, Sarah was awarded the Migration Partner of the Year by Lawyers Weekly. Frances Rush is the CEO of the Asylum Seekers Centre in Sydney, which provides practical and personal support for people living in the community who are seeking asylum. She has enormous experience as a social worker in both the government and community sectors. And last year, she was awarded an Order of Australia Medal for her service to the community. Shikupa Tahiri is on the steering committee of the National Refugee-Led Advisory and Advocacy Group, and she's also a policy officer with the Refugee Council of Australia, the national umbrella body for refugees and people seeking asylum and the organisations that support them. The Australian Financial Review named Shikupa as one of Australia's top 100 women of influence in 2018. So welcome to the three of you. I'd like to begin by asking you, Sarah, whether you could outline the broad policy framework for refugees and people seeking asylum when it comes to the impact of COVID-19. So for instance, to what extent are they eligible for the various support packages that the government has provided? And do you know, for example, what might happen to people on the temporary safe haven enterprise visas if they can't fulfil the pathway requirements to apply for their next visa?
Thanks very much, Jane, and I want to thank all of you for coming today. And I must admit, hearing your intro just then, Jane, left me with chills, despite the fact this is kind of my everyday, but having someone tell it back to you is just such a stark reminder So, you know, as normal, the experience of people seeking asylum is founded in many different laws, policy, different areas of practice. At the moment, people seeking asylum, they're not only influenced by immigration and immigration law and policy, there's that of social security, there's that of public health directives. Now, they, like us, have to follow all the restrictions and the laws that are in place right now in terms of social distancing, eligibility to work, things like that. What is particularly apparent in COVID-19 is the distinction between us and them. Even between those that have that refugee status and don't have that refugee status. So in a nutshell, people when they arrive in Australia put in an application for protection, they're given a bridging visa. That bridging visa allows you to remain in the community, waiting until you have an outcome. Now, it's our experience, particularly for people that arrive by boat, that they're now waiting in their 7th year and they're still on that bridging visa. For people that are on bridging visas, they're not eligible for any government support whatsoever. The only thing that they might be eligible for is what's called as a Status Resolution Support Service Payment, SRSS. But as we know, many, many millions of dollars was cut from that program in 2018. And so many thousands of people were exited from that program and were left to rely on organisations such as Frances's. I'm sure she can reflect on that as well. And the community were left to support these people. Despite COVID-19, despite the fact that many people on bridging visas have lost their jobs, there is no government support for them. We then moved to temporary protection visa holders and safe haven enterprise visa holders, SHEVs. They're people that have been through the process, that have been recognised as refugees, many of whom that have been working in our community for, you know, nearly a decade. They're also not eligible for JobKeeper, and they're not eligible for those additional COVID payments purely due to the status of their visa. Now, had these people arrived a year earlier, had they arrived by plane, they would have access to the full supports. It's purely due to a punitive policy of continuing to punish people for arriving in Australia by boat that they're not eligible for that support. There is that other element of those on a safe haven enterprise visa, which requires them to work for 3.5 years in a regional area or study. And if you're working, you shouldn't be taking Centrelink payments. If you take any Centrelink payments, then you're not eligible to move on to an opportunity or a pathway enabling you to apply for another visa in Australia. I call that getting out of the refugee cycle. People on TPVs and SHEVs can only apply for another TPV or SHEV unless they meet these pathway requirements. Now, COVID-19 means for many of those visa holders that they cannot work and they cannot access Centrelink. And if they do stop working or they do access Centrelink, then access to that pathway evaporates, which means they're ultimately stuck in that continual indefinite visa process. And what we've seen is 1, no additional support for bridging visa holders. 2, no access to government support for people that have been in our community for 7-8 years. And 3, no exceptions being made to policies that already apply.
Sarah, thank you very much for those insights. I think if we can turn to you, Frances, you're dealing with people who are at the, experiencing this every day. And I wondered if you could tell us how you think people are managing in terms of their mental health. For instance, we know that many of your clients have experienced torture or trauma or have been held in detention for prolonged periods of time. How has lockdown and this lack of support that Sarah's referred to impacted on their well-being?
Thanks, Jane and Sarah and Shakufa. And hello to everyone who's watching this. It's had an enormous impact, which isn't surprising, of course, in terms of what you laid out, what Sarah has put on the table is people's everyday reality. I think, Sarah, you referred to it as us and them in terms of how people are seen. I think with people's mental health, there have been immediate impacts because we know that people who've come and sought asylum are incredibly resilient. and they have gone through an enormous amount. And many have been through torture and trauma. To arrive here and then be told you have almost no supports. And it comes back to really the essence of civil society. Agencies like ours and others in Sydney, across Australia, and we've been in discussion with each of those. What is incredibly concerning, I think, for all of us is people's fairly rapid deterioration in mental health, because overnight they were reliant on agencies like ours and their communities, their cultural communities, and where they were linked in. And then to have COVID-19 happen, and slowly, perhaps from January, you started seeing people lose their jobs. And then almost overnight, by March, people had lost, those who were lucky to get employment, had lost employment. And so they then had literally nothing overnight, because most people have had to work 3 or 4 part-time jobs, if they are able to be able to support some basic rent and a basic lifestyle. So you saw that sense of who's going to help, that sense of disbelief when people have said, as Sarah has said, 7 years you've been here, you've been contributing to our community, often been paying taxes, and yet you are not welcome. You are actually deliberately excluded from any of the support structures that you and I, throughout this pandemic, have been able to avail. And that is enormous impact. What we're saying is we had to close, we closed on the 20th of March. We let everybody know as much as we could through SMS technology. And of course, on the Monday, we had triple the number of phone calls. We set up a hotline to try and capture what was the need. And it was real distress. It was really people saying, I can't feed my children. I have no food. I can't pay my rent. Who's going to help me? And that's an immediate distress. On top of that, everyone, I think, throughout the pandemic has reacted differently to social isolation. But this added another layer for people who, some people have been here and have made connections, others haven't. So you've got that sense to it, you've got economic distress. And then when you see the government continuing to say messages like, or you could go home, which really becomes quite offensive in terms of that narrative when it's not a reality. It is in effect absurd to say that to people seeking asylum. So you are looking at being excluded, and you are not seeing, I think, through a pipeline that there is any sense of hope. So that together, those 3 things together, we know really contribute to a negative impact on people's mental health. So the importance of being able to stay connected. I think another aspect that we've seen really practically is that we, like so many services around Australia, have changed our way of delivering service. So we are now taking food to people. And when you see where people are living, some in garages, many families sharing, and we've seen an increase in people experiencing overcrowding, because as people lose their rent, and often they're not on a formal lease, then they're moving in with others. So we saw 4 families in a 2-bedroom flat recently. That's just one example. But also that sense of, I can't top up my mobile phone, becomes really critical. It becomes really critical, particularly for women in a domestic or a family violence situation, because that means they're already isolated, they're contained within potentially a very dangerous situation. And there is great fear, because there's fear of approaching people for help, what it would mean to their visa, their partner's visa, and their ability to stay in Australia. So that becomes really complicated. We're seeing also the impact on children. Today, I think if you saw the papers, you see the new figures released about the Kids Helpline, and there's a 25% increase in children calling that helpline. And what we do know about children is they're very attuned to the stress of their parents. So with COVID-19, there's enormous stress on families. There's stress on families who've lost their job, but people who are not on a temporary visa are eligible for at least job seeker. And this group of people are not. And that really contributes to that distress. So we are concerned and trying to do what we can to support cultural communities, to really encourage people who are calling us all the time. And when we see people, of how to stay connected. We're trying to get data to people so that they can be able to make contact and call for help when needed. So there's multiple layers. Many people have connected to the supports and the agencies such as Survivors of Torture and Trauma, STARTS, and equivalent agencies around Australia. And that's a really positive thing. But what would really address or have some impact on people's mental health is for the federal government to enable people to have access to a regular payment so that they can maintain their housing. They can at least become more stable and stay connected. So I think that's really important.
Well, Frances, thank goodness for organisations like yours around the country, because I think given the absence of other support, I mean, it's already a very dire situation you're describing, and one hates to think what it would be like if people like you weren't there at the other end of the phone and the internet. Shakufa, you are part of a national refugee-led organisation, NRAG, and you recently released a report that found among the hardest hit were those on bridging visas and temporary protection visas, the elderly and LGBTIQ refugees. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the findings, please, and also how people's past experiences have shaped their ability to deal with this new challenge.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everybody else. Thank you all for having me. This is a really useful webinar at a very useful time to be in. Actually, addressing your first question in relation to how refugees are finding that their past experience may be shaping their ability to deal with the current situation. Well, you know, as Frances and Sarah actually outlined, there is just such a complex web of vulnerabilities facing particularly people on TPV, SHEV, and people seeking asylum who are on bridging visas. You know, that obviously coupled with the existing and outstanding limbo, but also the uncertainty that comes with the COVID-19 and considering the fact that, you know, these are members of families that have actually members of the rest of their members of the families stuck elsewhere in the world with really poor health system and an uncertain consequence of COVID-19 on the rest of their families. So it is a very uncertain and vulnerable times. And I just don't think that, you know, refugees' past resilience actually has really translated into extra agility in dealing with this crisis that is a health crisis and a pandemic. And you know, as we were seeing, I don't think that the gold standard response in terms of health and economic response from the federal government has translated into anything for vulnerable groups like refugees, just because they have been, you know, deliberately excluded from the support measures. And that has really meant that there is a huge other mountain for them to climb on the top of every other vulnerability that they've had in the past. And so the support structure that has been built in the COVID-19 environment really hasn't been extended to them. And it's a nation that is dealing with the crisis together, but really excludes the most vulnerable from actually you know, being extended the support measures that everybody else is. So it's not a very leveled playing field for them to deal with this situation. So they're not dealing really well with it. In relation to NRAG, NRAG is actually, just to give a bit of a context, NRAG is launched this year, February. So it's a pretty new entity, but it has been actually a long-standing vision that has actually, you know, then transcended into a refugee-led advocacy organization. It really emerges out of the void that has existed for a long time, where people from lived experience, people from and from affected communities haven't been at the very core of advocacy, you know, policy, media, and public discourse. And so NRAC has come about to fill that gap and make sure that, you know, the leadership and the lived experience of people as a means of expertise translates into positive policy changes. And the philosophy of NRAG is, of course, premised on the strength that the refugees bring, not just in terms of, you know, the shock value or the cognitive response that they can create with their experiences, but translating that into a very important wisdom, and then fitting that into decision-making processes that affect them most, and going beyond, you know, the storytelling or shock value that I just talked about. So NRAG really aims to include people in the policy decision-making. It ensures that, well, it aims at least to extend those decision-making tables to people of affected communities. And it aims to include all groups of refugees, and that includes stateless people, people seeking asylum, members of the LGBTI community, who are, you know, more marginalized inside a marginalized community. So even though this is not a novel idea, I think that the emergence of a national-led refugee entity is a very new idea. It is a very new thing. Because at the state level, it has existed, where refugee-led entities have led the voices to some extent, but has only been in 2018 when that has translated into global refugee-led movements, and now a national one. So it really makes sense, and it's a very timely thing to have happened. But onto the research, actually, and the substance of the work of NRAG, which really is based on the consultation and the unique position that it has when it comes to communicating with the community, and the relationship it shares with communities that the steering committee actually represents, not exhaustively, but at the very best, a representative body. There, you know, like you mentioned, Jane, it reiterated the fact that people from, you know, people seeking asylum, people on bridging visas, people on TPV SHEV, people from LGBTIQ communities are the most hard hit in this crisis, essentially because they're not actually included as part of the response recipients. And the four theme that actually came out was really focused on asylum issues, the issues with digital divide and literacy amongst refugee communities, which detailed the fact that there's such a dilemma for many groups within the refugee community to close the digital divide, and there seems to be a lot of problem with equitable access to online resources and services. So while you see that there are a lot of resources for at least, you know, the settled refugee communities, they're not, you know, translated in a way that actually reaches or fulfills the intention of those translated materials or resources. And so people who need it most are obviously, you know, the elderly at this very time. And so the digital literacy really was a dominant part of the discussion when it came to digital divide. And it posed major challenges for homeschooling and online learning for refugee youth, because they do live in households where parents are essentially not able to help them. But also, I think there was, you know, a very clear theme that, you know, all of this all of these challenges posed a very complex intersection for people seeking asylum and people on temporary visas with their families stuck, and with the long-standing, you know, policies and directions from the federal government that keep them separated in these very vulnerable times. I mean, the report is a 15-page outcomes report, and if anybody's interested to read that in detail, I will leave that to them. But I suppose for the sake of time, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much, Shakufa, and it's wonderful to see that NRAG has got off the ground. It's so important, as you say, to have refugee-led initiatives and voices being part of this debate, and it seems quite astounding that it's taken until now for this to really become something that's recognised globally. So thank you for your work too. Sarah, back to you. I was wondering if we could turn now to people who are in detention. Do you think that arguments about COVID-19 and the safety, or rather the insecurity of detention, might be used more broadly to support arguments for the abolition of detention for people seeking asylum altogether? And on this, I wondered whether state premiers or state health ministers have been approached about the risk of coronavirus to those being held in detention centres and facilities?
Thanks, Jane. And I think, you know, we've heard so much about the people in the community that are suffering, and RACS, we're hearing countless calls from people. Our job to make sure they're lawful so they can get Medicare, so that they can access services like Francis's. You know, that's been a real big focus of RACS. But on the other hand, we're also supporting hundreds of people that are in the detention network. And we've seen, you know, the past couple of days, a horrific rise in the number of suicide attempts for people in detention right now. I personally put that down to the angst and the anxiety of the people that I'm speaking to in an environment where they cannot take any measures to protect themselves. Detention centres, you're sharing rooms with sometimes 3-4 people. We understand that there have been measures taken to spread people a bit more out, but still people are in rooms of 2. It's very difficult. You know, something that I was turning my mind to is even when I visit a detention centre, how many doors and how many gates I have to push through, how many times I would have to touch a button in order to let me through, and things like that. We think, well, you know, sure, we can put some more hand sanitizer, people can wash their hands a little extra. But the reality and the environment of detention ultimately means that it is impossible for people in those centres to socially distance to the point that we have been instructed to do here in the community, which is why it is such a risk. The other side of that is that we are all feeling isolation. We are struggling that we can't go and see our mums and that we can't go to the pub with our friends. Well, detention centres are in complete lockdown. You know, I as a lawyer can't get in to see my clients, let alone community visits, let alone family members going to visit people in detention, which is a real reprieve for them, particularly for those with mental health issues. Now, I'm certainly not advocating that we should let everyone into the detention centres right now, because of course at the same time we're saying people should be released because those detention centres are fraught with issue. But we haven't got a balance right. We're seeing a real decline of people that are struggling, and we're not seeing any change in how we treat those people. The government has available to it many options to release people from detention. One, let them go and live with their families if they have them, or 2, community detention, which would enable people to be in the community, access support, and be able to protect themselves. I mean, it's quite difficult. You know, one of the oversights of detention is having places like the Red Cross go in and to monitor. Well, right now they can't do that because those centres are in lockdown, which is a real concern. More concerning is we've seen the government today announce their intent to pursue a bill that was before government a few years ago, which will increase the search and seize powers of Australian Border Force. It is, I can't even comprehend that right now in COVID-19, we're having a conversation about increased powers of officers, but we're not having a conversation about the rights of people in detention. And, you know, me as a lawyer helping those people out, it's a constant struggle for me to wrap my head around what's going on in this outside world whilst ignoring the people that are inside. And I guess one final point that I do want to make is that I well appreciate the detention issue is complicated. I appreciate that there are a number of people in there that have served a significant period of time in jail and the like, and that raises a lot of anxieties in our community. But there are hundreds of people that have been on Nauru and Manus that are in detention that have commit absolutely not a remote crime. Their only crime is to be come to Australia, and they're now facing 7 years of detention. And to continue to lock those men and women, let's not forget that there are women also in detention, these exceptionally vulnerable people that were transferred to Australia for medical treatment. We have left them in an environment that has been flagged as one of the highest risks in a COVID-19 world, and it's just completely unfathomable to me. So I'm not sure I really answered your question. I just more ranted about what the issue is, but it's just a really important issue. And we're talking about 1,400 people 1,400 people that we could very quickly find a solution for.
Sarah, I mean, you've spoken there of the challenges that obviously people themselves are facing, but how difficult it makes your job as a lawyer trying to assist people. And I know that's something that you and the other lawyers at RACS have had to face for a long time. And as with the others, I'd really like to thank you for your work. In fact, a question has just come through from an audience member, which follows on from something you were saying. And it was in relation to people who have been medevaced here from Manus Island and Nauru, and whether you know what support is available. It sounds like for those who are in detention, you've just outlined that, but are you aware of anything else?
Yeah, so I guess firstly, a number of them still remain in detention. There are some who are lucky that are in community detention, but there is another issue that it's not really known to many, and that is that most transitory people, that's what they're labelled as by the department, are only issued bridging visas for sometimes 3 to 6 months. Now, that means every 3 months, every 6 months, you need to reapply for your bridging visa. And you need to do that in order to still be able to access Medicare. So a big part of RAC's job at the moment is reapplying for bridging visas. It's an absolute menial task. It's not overly complicated, but it's quite literally the difference between support and protection and nothing. Bridging visa processing is incredibly long. Sometimes people wait weeks up to months where they're unlawful, waiting for the minister to make a decision on that bridging visa. Now, at that time, as we've heard, in a public health crisis, Medicare couldn't be more important. And so a big part of what RACS is doing now is calling the department every day with a list of people that we still don't have bridging visas for to try and hurry that system along. And that's just another way, even for the people that have been on Nauru Manus that are here in our community, it's just another way that our government continues to punish them for doing so.
Yeah.
Thank you for those insights, Sarah. Francis, I'll turn back to you. You mentioned that shortly, or just after the Asylum Seeker Centre closed because of the pandemic, you were inundated with 3 times the number of normal calls. So quite clearly, there are immediate impacts that these measures are having for people seeking asylum who are living in the community. So, what are the immediate impacts for them, but what do you think are likely to be the longer term impacts for people as the pandemic continues and as the effects themselves roll on in time?
And thank you. Before answering that, can I just add into an area that Sarah touched on as well?
Sure.
Because I think one of the areas that you raised, and RACS does so much work in that, is to bring to the attention of the government the options for people to come out of detention centres. And I know that there's a lot of behind the scene advocacy. We've certainly played a part in that. Amnesty has played, Red Cross, and there has been a proposal put forward by a number of community groups with the legal groups to say we would support the government, we would support people coming out. So the government has options and continues to say no, and people are trying to become part of the solution. So that resistance really adds to a different kind of layer of exclusion. And I think it's just that it often becomes, because the advocacy is behind the scenes, lost, but it is there, and it needs to highlight a government continuing to say no when there are people offering support. One of the huge areas that we've seen, and Sarah touched on this as well, for the people who've been medically evacuated from Manus and Nauru, is that often they're placed in the community, if they're not in detention or community detention, and they come to agencies like ours and many others across Australia, and they're not eligible for any support. So, for example, we're continuing to provide financial support and assist in accommodation for those people who've been medically evacuated and are here and are needing support. Whilst we closed our doors to people coming into the centre, what we did do was keep open our health clinic. For the very reasons that Sarah said, there are people here without access to Medicare, and often it is just a bureaucratic void. It could be renewed, but there is a lag time, and that really impacts on people, particularly now. So we've kept our clinic going, and we've got 2 amazing doctors who've given their time from University of New South Wales and Sydney University, and have done that for many, many years. And that's been really vital. It also means that when people have no income whatsoever, and say, for example, you're diabetic, you need insulin. That need doesn't stop because you don't have access to funds. So agencies like ours, and this is when we've had really strong connection with state level support from Ministry of Health, where we can try and look at accessing subsidised pharmaceuticals, fundraising around that, and also being able to work in to get a response for people. But you're right in the sense of there's been an immediate crisis response to the issues that people have faced and the solutions to it. So the obvious one is food. I think there is food travelling across Sydney everywhere. There are fantastic creations of new opportunities between councils we're seeing with Oz Harvest, and again with health. So there have been opportunities really pioneered by City of Sydney, for example, where they're giving out hampers of food provided by Oz Harvest. You can get a hot meal, you can also get a flu vaccination, and you can get a COVID-19 test. So bundling is a really innovative approach to how you can provide support. So one thing in the short term is food and getting it to where people are rather than expecting for people to come in. Housing is critical. In the short term, people, if you're on a lease, you can't be forcibly evicted. But many of the people we support are in arrears and have been probably since January. The big fear is people might go into payday lending, and that would be disastrous. But the reality is you are going to have a debt. You may well, you might have a delay of going before a tenancy tribunal for 2 months, but then you may well still be evicted, and you will have a debt and you'll have a negative outcome from a tribunal, and that does not bode well for the future. So the housing issue and the homelessness issue is going to be an enormous one that we need to address. The access to schooling, and what Shakufa was really highlighting, I thought, was that digital divide, that real importance of enabling people to stay connected, that almost continuum of care, isn't it? So that you don't let people fall through the cracks. That, I think, is really vital. That ongoing concern about people and overcrowding. We've seen from countries overseas like Singapore and Thailand what happens when people are not supported. They're excluded from supports. And as we are seeing, there are many, many people sharing very small and cramped arrangements because they have no choice. For example, not only is the exclusion from Centrelink support happening, but when you look at homeless agencies, the issue of homelessness, because of a complicated funding arrangement between federal and state, means that the first question is asked is what Centrelink payment you're on. And of course, people aren't on a payment. Then it's like saying, no, we can't support people on temporary visas. So there's been this tremendous response from New South Wales to put people who've been rough sleeping or on homeless accommodation into hotels, and that's a short-term response, but it excludes people seeking asylum, people on temporary visas. The long-term effect of that really will need enormous creative thinking. I think we could say we're between stories. We're not really sure what's going to happen with COVID-19 and winter. We need to understand and map that and try and be ahead of the curve. But what we can see in the long term, there are new partnerships. Shakufa talks about that with NRAG as well, and that look at settlement services, providing great support for people who are recognised as a refugee. But again, in that continuum, there probably will be new partnerships there for people seeking asylum, because that's where we're heading towards settlement. So I think there are those options. There are also the need to look at really creative outcomes. One of the ones put forward in the paper today around homelessness and those people in hotels is to look at a match within the construction industry, because you're looking at a great deal of job loss, but there's going to be a great deal of requirement for social housing. Obviously, the people who are homeless and are fortunate, which is great, people in hotels, they're saying that that might cease in September. Are you really going to put people back on the street? There are lots of those kind of challenges. But for people seeking asylum, I think the issue will be that in employment, which is critical, majority of opportunities for employment that people seeking asylum were able to get were in the entertainment, were in the food industry. And we know that those are the industries that will come back much more slowly, and many, unfortunately, won't come back. So this issue is going to be around for a while. And I think the long-term effect is we can't ignore the fact that people do need a basic income support whilst they wait. As Sarah said, people have waited for 7 years in limbo. And as Jane, as you said, the borders are closed. People are not going to go anywhere. We have to grapple with and really become creative and look at inclusion of people and not exclusion. I should finish it there.
Francis, someone has just asked if someone living in the community seeking asylum does become sick with COVID-19, what happens? I mean, particularly for those who may not have other support. Are you aware of anyone already, or what do you think is going to happen?
I think it's a great question, and we've been trying to plan of what would happen, because it seems, depending on what happens now, it could be inevitable, or we might have squashed that curve. I think this is where you've got great support, say in New South Wales, and I really appreciate every state has different policy frameworks and attracts this differently. But in New South Wales, the Ministry of Health, with Refugee Health as part of that, have agreed to support people. And that also means, because we've been we were concerned that some people who we sent for testing, because we were concerned for their health, what would happen if they were COVID-19 positive. The Ministry of Health have said that they will accommodate people and they will address in that self-isolation. It's obviously a short-term response, but at least it is a response.
Thank you. Shakufa, I'll turn back to you now. And I wondered if you might be able to tell us what the risks of the COVID-19 situation are for children and young people from refugee backgrounds when it comes to things like their education, learning, well-being. And maybe as part of that, or it might have come up separately, I know it did in relation to the elderly in your report, what sort of barriers are digital literacy and also English language skills creating?
That's a very important question, and I think that groups of young people within the refugee communities are affected very differently. There isn't like a blanket consequence for everybody, because I think that the rate and degree of digital literacy really differs from one family to the other and from one young person to the other, depending on what type of legal status they have, how long they've been in the country, how synchronized their families are with the whole digitization era, and so the experiences have been really varied in there, but I would say that for young people who are actually holding temporary protection visas, especially, and as we heard in our consultation, it's very concerning when you hear second year university students saying that, on Chef saying that, I'm about to actually drop out of university because I can't get special benefit because I'm actually enrolled in a course that's beyond 12 months. So just the rigidity of and the complexity of the requirement to get special benefit, the lack of flexibility, and I think the lack of equity in the system for young people who are studying at tertiary level, it's really disheartening, because you see potentially a really great individuals and very highly skilled individuals dropping out of university and ending up in really crowded accommodation and potentially ending up with a job that's, that they take up out of compulsion. And I have to say that a lot of young people have lost their jobs, and people, especially on temporary protection visas and bridging visas, have particularly found it really difficult to get a job, but also not be entitled to any of the economic stimulus packages from the government. But when it comes to resettled refugees and refugee families, I think the level of preparedness was obviously not there, but that's common with everybody. Homeschooling is a very new concept for a lot of those families who don't themselves have actually very basic literacy in their first language, let alone navigating this really complex ecosystem when it comes to homeschooling and making sure that their children are actually keeping up with education. But also for some families, it also means that they might not have the digital means. So, in terms of internet that's fast enough, or laptops, etc. But I think that children and young people especially, bear the burden a lot of the time, in that on the one hand, the parents really can't understand what's going on locally. So you'd hear that there's a lot of circulation of misinformation and circulation of conspiracy theories that they hear from often the outlets from their home countries, only because they're not able to get their hands on locally available and understandable information in Australia. So that really presents a lot of issues for young people sometimes to translate for their parents. And I think that when it comes to that, there's also a difficulty in parents understanding the third language almost that these refugee young people and children develop, because it can be very jargonistic when it comes to the resources available, but also when you see simple things like translated materials available on how the COVID-19 economic supplements work, and you read them. They are in very academic, very complex language that your average literate person would not understand, let alone parents who don't have literacy in their first language. So I mean, the government and the government departments and settlement services, they've done a great job of making sure that they do their best, but I think that there is a long way to go before the information actually becomes useful. I think that the recommendations that came out of the consultation was that people really wanted and they really needed actually video visuals and audio visuals, or even simple things like in-text reading ability on the websites for the information to become useful. So the young people and children are actually really navigating a very complex environment in their homes now that they're confined to their homes. And there is no escape from actually burdening that responsibility of making sure that their parents, their grandparents, and the extended members of their family remain safe, while also navigating this new environment where they have to learn as well as go forward with their education, keep up. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, there are clearly issues of access and equity across the board, whether it's at different generations or in different sectors, and it just bringing that focus back to children again shows the impact it's having right across the whole community.
Absolutely. The fact that there is a very decentralized system when it comes to sharing resources, or decentralized way of doing things for refugee communities when it comes to information sharing at the very least, it really goes, really the burden then falls onto family members, and those family members are often young people because they're agile in both languages most of the time.
Thank you. A question has come through from a number of different people about what role state governments can and are playing to assist people seeking asylum and refugees. I wondered if I might throw to you, Frances, for your take on that, please.
Yes, it's a great question. I think when you look at the state governments and ACT, for example, as well, there has been a lot of support, a lot of a different kind of support. Let me just say that in the moment, New South Wales and Western Australia are the two states who have not provided a comprehensive COVID-19 package for people on temporary visas. So that being in New South Wales and Sarah, RACS being in New South Wales, it is not for the want of trying or representation. Saying that, there are elements and departments within each state that are doing tremendous work. When you look at Victoria, very early gave significant funds, even when, as Sarah referred to, the Status Resolution Support Service, when that income support for people seeking asylum ceased in March 2018, Victoria gave funds, ACT gave funds, and Queensland gave funds. New South Wales didn't. With COVID-19, you can see that even as 2 weeks ago, Tasmania and South Australia gave funds. So in recognition of the destitution that is being faced by people on temporary visas, and particularly people seeking asylum, within the state, like say for New South Wales, where I can speak of, there has been exceptional support from Department of Education, and in terms of refugee support within schools, and really recognising that not everyone has access to data, all the issues that Shakufa just talked about in terms of that burden on family, and who are trying to navigate a system or a new system to do this on top has been difficult, but they've shown really strong leadership. Ministry of Health has done that. Through Department of what was Industry, now back with Education, looking at employment programs. So that's a positive, but there is not enough work done by the states. Many of the states tend to look at it that it's a federal issue. And in essence, it is in terms of a Centrelink payment. And it really sits within the Federal Minister for Social Services and the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, who we believe have the discretion to include people on temporary protection, on a Centrelink support, and are deciding not to actually include people. So that's an issue, and it plays down on the state. But what it really plays down to is the community and communities and charities.
Thank you. Look, I've got a couple more questions before we're going to be at the end of this session, and I'd like now just to turn back to you, Sarah, and then I'll ask the final question to Shakufa. Sarah, it's fair to say that 2020 has been a very tough year in Australia, from the bushfires over the summer, and then just a few months later to the COVID-19 pandemic. In both of these crises, we've seen some outstanding acts of generosity and leadership, solidarity and compassion. But I wondered if you could perhaps reflect a little bit on how you think we might be able to harness this empathy and community-mindedness as we move forward, particularly when it comes to supporting refugees and people seeking asylum.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I guess to be in the position that I am and to have worked with RACS for as long as I have to be an eternal optimist that things are going to get better. I think we saw during the bushfires, Australia turn to each other. We turned outwards. We, in the cities, we were supporting the regions. For people that fled, we embraced them. We sent food packages, we sent blankets, we opened our homes. People were offering to house people's pets. As a community, we all wrapped around each other. I've been a little disheartened to see that the opposite happened during COVID. During COVID, we've shut our doors, we've isolated from people. We've said that community can look after themselves. These people can go home. I'm staying here in my little corner of the world. And I really hope that there is some way that we can take these crises and reflect on a community as to what we want to be. And I think what we want to be is the Australia that responded during the bushfires, not the Australia that we're seeing during COVID. I want to reflect a little bit on, yes, we've seen our other states, particularly Victoria, put money towards supporting people with financial payments. But really remarkably, the Victorian government also funded legal services. And, in New South Wales, we have never seen that support. And right now, legal services are getting people the visas. Visas equal rights. Rights equals the little bit of support that people can muster. And so I'm really encouraged to see the Victorian government step up and recognise that. And I hope that that will lead to some change in the other states, particularly when I'm not as confident we're going to see that on a federal level. What has also been really remarkable, RACS has a petition at the moment, and we have seen hundreds of people sign that petition in support of financial support for people seeking asylum and people on temporary visas. You know, one of the big things that we struggled with is it's really hard to continue to ask the community for financial support right now when so many people have lost their jobs and they're worried about their own livelihoods. And one of the biggest questions we are getting constantly is, I'm really sorry, I can't donate right now, but what can I do? Well, what you can do is pick up your phone and call your MP and say, what are you doing to support people in our community? What you can do is you can share and like the posts of the organisations on this call. You can sign petitions saying you stand with people that are vulnerable and you stand with people that need support in the community. And I mean, every like on a RACS Facebook post is just a little push for me in particular and a little push for my team. Because I'm sure, and you know, Shakuva can speak to this as well, it can be very isolating for the professionals in this space also. You feel like you're constantly fighting a fight that shouldn't be fought. And so there's so many things that the community, that our supporters do that really push us that little bit further to keep fighting for the people that we fight for. But also it's something that you can do so you don't feel quite so helpless in a crisis that you are helpless in. I mean, I can't stop COVID-19. I don't have a solution for a global pandemic, but I do know that picking up the phone and speaking to the people that call RACS makes a difference. And so that's why we keep doing it. And so we need everyone to keep rallying around the organisations like RACS and ASC so that that community can continue to be supported.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, just
really quick. I really want to echo what Sarah's saying, and I want to do a shout out to all our staff and all staff around Australia, because the heroes of the bushfires were the firefighters, the volunteers. All of us are volunteer-led. So we've got amazing staff who are taking the really difficult calls and doing their best to support people. So it's to our staff and it's also to our volunteers and the volunteer community, because like RACS and like so many other agencies, despite the downturn in the economy, there has been overwhelming support and people going, I don't agree with the federal government. I want to do something. I want to make a difference. So really, it's a shout out to all, I think. Sorry.
Thank you very much. And I absolutely would endorse that, as I'm sure we all would. Shakuva, the final word goes to you, and it's on this same point. So many of the people in the audience have been asking, what can we do? How can we join, or what possibilities are there for collaborative work between refugee communities, the broader local community, and even government here in this pandemic?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I echo absolutely everything that Frances and Sarah said. And would like to add that, bushfires were strong reminders that, given the compelling displacement situation then, really forced people to flee for their life. It was a very intuitive thing to do rather than something that they liked to do, something that they had a choice in. So, constantly reflecting back as to, just the sources of displacement and why people have fled in the first place and have caught themselves in this web of vulnerability, reflecting back on whys, but also how they can be helped. I think that at this time, it's ever more important to really tap on the universal and shared values of sharing, empathy, solidarity for the most marginalized groups in our societies, because this is a collective fight. This is a health crisis. The virus is not going to discriminate against anybody. If someone from refugee community or someone who has a temporary visa that's infected by a virus, it really threatens the health of everyone in Australia. So I think that that movement has to come from within, from the public, and we can actually, there are ways to create that solidarity by making sure that people are people are drawn into this arrangement of allyship, where they are able to call on their representative to seek support for the most marginalized in our communities, the marginalized groups that we've been talking about all of this webinar. And so and then referring back to leaving nobody behind in this crisis, and that this is not just an Australian problem. It doesn't stop within our borders. It is a global pandemic. So it has to be approached with a sense of shared, shared grievance and shared effort to combat it. And I think that also going back to just co-designing and actually working with affected communities in a very meaningful ways, where you partner with them, where you have equal standing with them, and you share ways of working with each other and share solutions in response to shared issues. I mean, there are many ways, but I think those are some of just the main principles.
Thank you very, very much. And if I can say, I think with the leadership that the three of you and all those in your organisations are showing, we're in very good hands, but obviously we need a lot of support from the community as well. And on that note, I'd like to thank so much all of you in the audience who've been with us today to learn from this really rich, informative discussion. I'd encourage you to keep an eye out for our future webinars that we're going to be having on related topics. Finally, I'd like to thank the Kaldor Centre team for making this event possible. And I wish all of you good health and safety in this pandemic. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.